Good afternoon and welcome to the National Center for Rural Road Safety's March webinar. We're just going to give everyone a few minutes to file in here and then we'll get started. Again, we appreciate you for joining our March webinar. We're going to let everyone file into the room and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right. Welcome to the National Center for Rural Road Safety's March 26th webinar entitled Making Safe the Easy Choice, Practical Behavior Strategies to Influence Your Safer Road Behaviors. My name is Jamie Sullivan. I'm the director for the National Center for Rural Road Safety. We're really glad to have you with us today. Just a few webinar logistics. Our duration for today's webinar is an hour and a half. To activate closed captioning for the webinar, you're going to click on the Show Captions button at the bottom of your screen. You can also see an example of that in the top right of our PowerPoint currently. You can also use the drop down there at that to adjust captions under the caption settings. We are recording today's webinar for website archival, and it will be available on our website under the Webinar Archive drop down within about a week. We do have two different ways for you to communicate for us today. Many of you are using the chat pod already. When I'm done introducing our speaker, we will also put our participant handout for today in that chat pod. Feel free to talk back and forth there, share resources as Kari is doing her presentation. If you do have questions for Kari today, we would ask that you please put those in the Q&A pod so that it's easier to find them, as there will be a lot of chatter going on in the chat pod. Additionally, if you have any technical difficulties, please alert us using the Q&A pod or individually messaging us through the chat pod. We will have, as I mentioned, those participant handouts available for download shortly, and you'll find those in the chat pod. We'll post them several times throughout today's webinar so that you can download those. At the very end of our webinar, we will have a feedback form for you to complete. We would love to hear from you about how this webinar went and what additional topics you would like to see us address over the next year. Additionally, we do provide certificates of completion as well as a application for the more formal CEUs if you need those as well. Those certificates of completion come out about 4 to 6 weeks after our webinars. So you will see those in just a few weeks. I do also want to thank the NLTAPA Safety Work Group for co-hosting today's webinar. And before we get started, we have just a few announcements for you. Our very first one is that we have a brand new episode of our Home Safely podcast. Episode 8 features Vic Lund, who is a traffic engineer at the St. Louis County, Minnesota Department of Public Works. In this podcast, he'll talk about identifying opportunities to reduce crash risk by assessing risk factors, local road safety plan planning processes, and what it means to be proactive in rural road safety. So we hope that you'll take a look at this podcast as well as listen to the first 7 if you haven't joined us for any of those. These QR codes will all be available in the handout that we will provide for you as well. I just wanted to mention about our Road Safety Champion program as well. It's currently underway. We are starting our maintenance and construction modules on Tuesdays from 1 to 3 p.m. on April 14th. Additionally, our first responder modules are going to be starting as well. The very first module is also Planning and Engineering 5, so it will be held next Tuesday, March 31st. And then the rest of the first responder modules will be held on Wednesdays from 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time, starting on April 15th. Those are open for registration now on our website, so we'd love to have you join us for those. Wanted to remind you all that FHWA is doing a Rural Road Safety webinar series. The second webinar in their series will be held on Thursday, May 21st from 1 to 3 p.m. Eastern on innovative funding processes for rural road safety. You can use this QR code here to register for that webinar if you're interested in listening in. They will be talking about innovative funding programs, alternative contracting methods, and flexibilities to distribute resources effectively and efficiently, and then also some additional strategies. Another piece of information for you all is that Routes Initiative, or the Rural Opportunities to Use Transportation for Economic Success, it has a request for information out right now. They would like to hear from you all about your unmet transportation infrastructure needs in rural communities, barriers that rural communities face in addressing those needs, and opportunities for the Routes Initiative to improve its services and technical assistance to support rural and tribal stakeholders. This request for information was posted on February 23rd, 2026, and will be open for 60 days. So around April 23rd is when it will close. And again, this QR code here will take you to that request for information and provide additional information for you on how to respond to that and give them your feedback. But we highly recommend that if you have feedback to provide, that you do that. And then I wanted to give you all a sneak peek for Rural Road Safety Awareness Week. As always, we'll be holding this the third week in July, which will be July 13th through the 17th this year. Our theme for 2026 will be Rural Modes on the Road to Zero. Our graphical theme this year will be video games. So we're excited to show you some of those graphics as we get those completed. Our daily topics will go through conventional vehicles on Monday, micro movers on Tuesday, transit on Wednesday, big movers on Thursday, and unconventional vehicles on Friday. Some of the things that you can expect to see from the Center for Rural Road Safety Awareness Week will be a customizable proclamation, a customizable press release. We'll have social media posts. We will have daily graphics that you can use. And then we'll have daily web pages as well with resources for you to use too. So more on that coming in the next couple months, but we did want to provide this information to you. This QR code will take you to our homepage for Rural Road Safety Awareness Week. It is currently being updated to include this information for you. So follow along there. And as we release stuff, we will be sending it out through our email distribution list. And then lastly, I would like to introduce today's presenter. Today, we are very excited to have Kari Finley with us. She is the director of the Center for Health and Safety Culture at Montana State University. She's the principal investigator on many projects that focus on traffic safety and growing healthy and safe cultures to reduce roadway fatalities and serious injuries. She is also a contributing author to the book Traffic Safety Culture, Theory, Foundation, and Application. And so now I am very excited to turn our presentation over to Kari.
Great, thank you so much. Let me just share my screen and we'll get started. All right, do you see my screen okay, Jamie?
Yes, we can.
Awesome, great. So I'm really excited to be here with you today and talking about making safe the easy choice. So strategies, behavior strategies, influence safer road user behaviors. As traffic safety professionals working in our communities, we're often tasked, I think, with designing for what people should do. But we know that our best designs don't always align perfectly with what people actually do on our roadways. I think in the field of transportation, we've made huge shifts to embrace the importance of the safe system approach, recognizing human error and vulnerability, and taking a whole system approach to design a transportation system that prevents deaths and serious injuries, even when crashes occur. We are approaching our work in traffic safety from this place of intentionality. And as we think about the safe system approach, we know that much of our work focuses on behaviors, absolutely shifting risky behaviors, designing for human error. And when we think about behaviors, we want people to choose the safe behavior. We want people to not choose the risky behavior. So today we're going to talk about, and I'm going to introduce a variety of just practical strategies that we can use to influence safer road user behaviors. Really diving into thinking about how we can implement strategies that make safe the easy choice. And to do that, we're going to start with just a really brief conversation about behavior models and how they can really help us to inform the work that we're doing. We're going to think about our work and talk about it through a cultural lens. And then finally, we're going to discuss some specific strategies that can influence behaviors that are grounded in research and that we can think about implementing with our current strategies and also for future strategies. So let's just dive right in today. If we're trying to reduce serious injuries and fatal crashes on our roadways, we can think about what we want less of. What are those risky behaviors that we want to reduce? Things like speeding, less distracted driving, less driving impaired. Those behaviors we could put in this red arrow. We can also think about what we want more of, what protective behaviors we want to grow. Maybe we want more people wearing their seatbelts, more people driving the speed limit, more people using a ride share or getting a designated driver when they've been drinking so that they don't drive impaired. Those behaviors we can think about would go in that green arrow. Whether we're trying to reduce risky behaviors or grow protective behaviors, all of these require behavior change. And when we think about behavior change, if we want to create change, we know that we need to start understanding why people engage in the behaviors that they do. A behavior model is really just a scientific framework that can help us understand and explain and predict why people behave the way they do, especially when we think about health and safety and decision making. This is a really simplified version of an integrated behavioral model that we use at the Center for Health and Safety Culture when we think about our work in traffic safety. And really simply, what this model illustrates is that our values and beliefs influence our behaviors, and ultimately those behaviors influence the consequences that we see on our road. A behavioral model can help us in a lot of different ways, and I won't go into a lot of details today, but I think when we think about a behavior model, when we think about helping it and using it as a scientific framework, we can identify factors that influence behaviors, and they can guide the design of our interventions that ultimately change those risky behaviors that we're working on in traffic safety. A behavior model provides us with a scientific basis for how beliefs and behaviors predict other beliefs and behaviors. A behavior model can provide us insight into what are those perceptions that people have? What are our motivations? What are other influences that are shaping the decisions that we make on the road? In the context of traffic safety, a behavior model really can help us understand those deliberate decisions that people make around wearing a seatbelt or speeding or texting or the various behaviors that we're thinking about in traffic safety. A behavior model can help us understand what we want to grow and also inform us about what we want to change in the behaviors that we want to focus on to change. And they can help us decide on specific interventions that we might want to use to address a specific behavior that we're working on. We may decide that we need to tailor our traffic safety messages to specific beliefs that people have about that issue. For example, a behavior model might help us to understand that teens, for example, if we're working with teens, 18 to 25-year-olds, that they may respond to messages that promote social norms or another belief about whatever behavior we're working on. And then finally, behavior models can really help us in our evaluation. It helps provide that structure for measuring constructs so that we can track those over time to see if the strategies that we're using are having the intended outcomes that we want to see. For our purposes today, I think the takeaway is that a behavior model like this can really be helpful when we're trying to influence behaviors, when we're trying to understand how to do that in our work, so that we are better able to do our jobs in traffic safety. To change the negative consequences or outcomes in traffic safety, we know that we need to focus on changing risky behaviors. And many of our strategies that we implement every day in traffic safety do focus on changing behavior. Behaviors of road users, absolutely, but also behaviors of stakeholders, not just road users. And we know that from research, to change behavior, we need to focus on changing beliefs. We need to understand how beliefs are influencing the behaviors we want to change and the behaviors we want to foster and grow. And the good news is that beliefs are not set in stone. Beliefs absolutely can be changed. If you just think about your 20-year-old self or your 35-year-old self, and you think about how the beliefs you have about something have changed, maybe your beliefs about a behavior like eating healthy, or getting enough sleep, or taking care of your health. How have your beliefs shifted over time? Maybe you've shifted your beliefs about, your work-life balance, or how you spend or save your money. Beliefs absolutely are malleable, and they change. And if we know that beliefs are so important to behavior change, the question that often comes up is, where do beliefs come from? Reflect on that for a minute. Where do beliefs come from? Not very long ago, we talked about, we did a webinar with the National Center for Rural Road Safety, and we talked about beliefs are based in our culture. And I'm going to recap that here, but if you're interested more about that, we did do a webinar, an archived webinar on beliefs and how they influence behavior. But if we think that beliefs are based in our culture, culture really are those shared beliefs of a group of people. If we think about culture as the shared beliefs of a group of people that influence behavior, then we can think about culture in the context of traffic safety. Traffic safety culture really are those shared belief systems of a group of people that influence road user behaviors and stakeholder actions that impact traffic safety. Now, there's a lot going on there when we think about traffic safety culture. And the first is that it's a shared belief system of a group of people. And we tend to share beliefs with lots of different groups of people that we belong to. If we're a school or a workplace, we belong to that group of people. And each of those groups have common goals, common shared beliefs. Workplaces, for example, might have a goal to successfully provide or create a certain product or service. And as a group of people in that workspace, we're going to establish and share certain beliefs to support that goal. Beliefs generally relate to our perceptions of what's normal and expected in our environment. Beliefs influence our willingness and our intention to behave in certain ways. In this definition of traffic safety culture, it's focused on the shared beliefs that influence road user behaviors, but also stakeholder actions that influence traffic safety. We can seek to not only change the traffic safety culture of road users, but of those stakeholder groups that can act in ways to support our traffic safety goals. That type of thinking expands the responsibility of traffic safety from relying on road users specifically to everyone in a shared responsibility amongst all the stakeholder groups. We know that when we think about behavior change, it is almost unanimously agreed that beliefs deeply affect our actions. The beliefs we have absolutely affect and impact our behaviors. And it's interesting to think about, if our work is to grow a positive traffic safety culture, then we want to start thinking through that lens, that our work is to influence and change those road user beliefs and stakeholder beliefs to support that safe traffic safety system. And we can be really intentional about that. We can be intentional about growing supportive beliefs that influence behavior and the protective and safer behaviors that we're seeking to grow, and ultimately changing those negative consequences or outcomes. When we think about culture, we want to start to operationalize that and think about it across the social ecology. Basically, the social ecology really helps us to understand that we don't operate in isolation. Absolutely. Our behaviors, our beliefs are influenced by all the different groups or layers of the social environment around us. We're influenced by our family and our friends, our organizations and our schools, and also our communities. And each of these layers influences our beliefs and ultimately our behaviors. So when we start to think and talk through these strategies to make safe the easy choice, we want to start thinking about strategies across the social ecology, shifting beliefs across the social ecology. So we see that beliefs are important to change behavior, and we can recognize that it's about behaviors across the social ecology. Different behaviors for different groups, each with their own beliefs. Okay, so now let's move into some practical strategies that can influence behaviors that help us to make safe that easy choice. To do that, I want to start by talking about how we process information and make decisions. All of us, we process information from the environment that we're in two different ways. And oftentimes in the research, these are called two different modes of thinking. And sometimes those modes of thinking are called fast and slow thinking. You might be familiar with those terms. These two modes differ in the amount of mental effort that it takes us, how much time it takes us, how much we scrutinize and process the information that we're taking in. Fast thinking is reactive, and it's automatic, and it doesn't take a lot of conscious effort. Fast thinking is fast because it really takes us little or no mental effort to do it. And as humans, we love fast thinking. We try to avoid mental energy or effort whenever possible, and we oftentimes will rely on fast thinking, that mode of information delivery. However, fast thinking can be a little misleading because in that we take mental shortcuts. We can make mistakes. In contrast to fast thinking is what we call slow thinking. And slow thinking is deliberate. It's reflective, and it takes a lot more mental, conscious effort to really think about something. Slow thinking is slow because that processing information that we're bringing in requires greater mental effort. Slow thinking takes more time, but it allows for us to take a more deep dive into analyzing the information that we're taking in. So let me just give you a couple of examples of fast and slow thinking. And we'll take a strategy in traffic safety specifically. So think about using an app that automatically turns your cell phone off, or it turns it to silent mode when you're driving. I think using an app like that is a really great example that illustrates both slow and fast thinking. So if we think about this strategy of using an app on your phone that turns it to silent mode when you drive, the strategy itself helps us to engage in slow thinking initially. It's really a deliberate decision that we have to make as drivers to decide, I'm going to get that app, I'm going to download it on my phone, I'm going to turn it on. We have to think through the decision of why I even want that app on my phone, the reasons that might be a good decision to make. And we have to make that choice. It's a rational choice that we have to intentionally decide to do. It can tap into our beliefs around safety maybe, and valuing the importance of, the driving task itself, that we don't want to have other distractions in the car with us when we're driving. But then that strategy is also a really good example of fast thinking in the long term. Because once you have that app and you've turned it on, you don't really have to think about it anymore. It just happens for us. So every time we get into the vehicle, that app is working in the background, silencing our phones from getting text messages or calls. We don't mentally have to think it through. We don't have to keep making that decision, use that app. That's an example in traffic safety of a strategy that uses both slow thinking and fast thinking. Another example might be to intentionally and slowly think about, from a traffic safety professional perspective, about the built environment. Examples might be deciding on the roadway design, putting roundabouts or speed bumps, speed limiters to slow drivers down. These are really intentional decisions. These are examples of traffic safety professionals making very intentional decisions about the built environment to support the habits of drivers and the fast thinking of drivers. So for example, going over a speed bump indicates to me as a driver that I need to slow down. It's a school zone. I don't give it a lot of thought. I don't need to think a lot about it. I just do it because the built environment has structured the environment in a way for me to slow down. That's another example of using very deliberate design strategies to implement to support the driver, to support drivers' behaviors. So when we think about strategies to support intentional behavior changes through our strategies, we want to think about strategies that can support both those thoughtful, deliberate, slow thinking strategies that then also can support fast thinking that don't take a lot of mental energy or effort for drivers. In practice, we want to implement strategies that include or support both fast and slow thinking whenever possible. And we can be really intentional about that when we think about what are strategies that we're implementing in our communities to support traffic safety. How do we build in some of that slow, deliberate thinking, but also can support those fast decision-making modes of thinking for drivers in the built environment. In practice, we want to ask ourselves, how well do the strategies that I'm implementing support both fast and slow thinking? Slow thinking is really an important piece in our traffic safety strategies because we need people to be able to process the information. We need them to reflect on their behaviors, to reflect on the beliefs they have about those behaviors, to take in the new information that they're learning about, why is it important to wear my seatbelt? Why do I slow down in this area? Why do I, why do I not need to drive distracted and have my phone on silent mode? We want people to reflect on those decisions, on those beliefs, so that we can start to shift those riskier beliefs that people have about those decisions. In other words, people do need to pause, reflect on their decision-making. Maybe in our campaign messages, for example, we can connect those to shared beliefs. How are the messages that we're implementing in our communities leading to more conversation? How are we facilitating those conversations in our community? Whether it's about wearing a seatbelt or speeding or distracted driving. It isn't just seeing the message on the billboard. That's important because that's it's starting to build that recognition, but we also want to move that to conversation. Changing behavior in the long term requires a person to be able to think about that message that they're seeing, how it applies to them personally, what changes they might want to make based on that new information. And that thinking is done through conversation to engage those slower thinking modes. Maybe it's an educational strategy that your DOT promotes. For example, maybe you're teaching the why behind a certain traffic safety rule. Maybe it's parent-teen driver agreements. And just that conversation with the parent and teen requires that slow thinking mode to be engaged. That conversation can move us to change beliefs and ultimately to change behaviors. So now I'd like you to take just a minute. We'll take just a few minutes actually. And if you would use the chat box, I want you to ponder this idea for a minute. And you can do that in a couple of different ways. Either you can use the chat box feature where you can share your thoughts for others to see in the webinar, or you could just spend some time reflecting on this question in a notebook or on a piece of paper at your desk. And the goal is to take this strategy to change behaviors, thinking about slow thinking, and think about it in your context. I'd like you to ask yourself, how could I integrate or foster slow thinking in a current strategy that I'm using in my community? Take a few minutes and either add that to the chat or write that down on a piece of paper. And I'll just give you a couple of minutes to ponder that. There are a lot of great comments coming into the chat. Thank you so much for sharing some of your ideas. Thinking about how, providing some of the things I'm seeing just in the chat as we're working, providing some time to decide, how do we make those pause points in our decision making? Adding things like, adding things to an app. I see from Colorado, like my Colorado app, thinking about how are we using our strategies. Fast thinking is great. It's important, absolutely, to have strategies that support fast thinking where we don't have to put a lot of mental energy into something. We can absolutely have strategies that support fast thinking. But it's also important to think through, how are our strategies fostering slow thinking? How can those, because we do know that both modes of thinking can support behavior change. These are great. All right. The second strategy that I want to talk about has to do with emotions. We know that beliefs and emotions are absolutely interconnected. And to understand that connection, we want to take a little detour to talk about emotions and how they influence our thinking pathways. Emotions are very powerful. People often rely on their emotions, either intentionally or unintentionally, to shape their judgments, to shape their decision making. Emotions influence both our thoughts and our behaviors or our actions. And if we think about going back to how we process information through those two different cognitive pathways, that intuitive, fast-thinking pathway and that analytic, more deliberate, slow-thinking pathway, the fast-thinking or that more intuitive system responds immediately and unconsciously, where that slow-thinking analytic system moves more slowly and depends on more deliberate, conscious reasoning. Now, the emotional center of the brain is highly reactive, which means that we as humans are really susceptible to our emotions and to language that speaks to our feelings. Emotional appeals, you think about all the different ways, all the different emotional appeals really work by bypassing that logical part of the brain and going straight to our unconscious. And it's really hard to argue with that. Emotional appeals work by activating an emotional response in us. That's what it's designed to do. And an emotional appeal is designed to motivate its audience to change their mind or to take action on an issue based purely on emotion, how we feel about something. The strategies that we use can appeal to lots of different kinds of emotions. Strategies can appeal to positive emotion or negative emotion. Appeals to a positive emotion are things like, how does it feel when you belong? When you feel safe? How does it feel when you feel secure? When you're comfortable? How does desire feel? Or that feeling of awe? Those are positive appeals. This is an example of a positive ad appeal. It's an ad that reminds people of how it feels when they get a letter from a loved one. It feels warm and comforting, and it activates this positive emotional response. Appeals also can appeal to negative emotions. The focus is to incite negative feelings. Negative emotions might be things like outrage, pity, guilt, shame, fear, envy. Those are all negative emotions. And absolutely, if you start to look at messages that are out there to us every day, oftentimes we see ads, we see messaging that seeks to evoke a negative response, outrage or sadness or fear. In this message, you can see kind of in the top of that billboard, it says, child soldiers. It's not happening here, but it's happening now. And that billboard, absolutely, how does it feel when you see that? It ignites this negative emotional response. Here's another advertisement. This one was found on the back of bus seats. It says, victims are people just like you and me. This ad is meant to elicit a negative emotional response of injustice, but also maybe a sense of fear. It brings the focus of this issue to a really personal level. It says, hey, this could happen to you too. Interestingly, in traffic safety, strategies that elicit negative emotions are quite common. We often talk about these kinds of emotions or kinds of approaches as fear-based approaches. Fear-based approaches are really just persuasive attempts to elicit that emotion of fear. And it's done by emphasizing the potential dangers and harms that'll happen if a person engages in whatever behavior we're talking about, or they choose not to do what's being recommended of them. This is an example. Here's a mock car crash, a fear-based approach demonstrating the harm and dangers of not wearing a seatbelt. This negative emotional appeal really is meant to arouse fear, to persuade and motivate the audience to engage in that protective behavior of wearing a seatbelt. Fear-based approaches typically have two types of information. First of all, it's an attempt, there's usually an attempt to arouse fear by presenting whatever the threat is that a person is susceptible to if they engage in whatever the behavior is, or maybe it's about the consequences for engaging in that behavior. In this case, the threat is a serious, painful injury or death because of jaywalking. Fear-based approaches usually include that threat component, which is information that points out the nature of the danger or the susceptibility of the audience to that danger. And then the second type of information that's often in a faith-based appeal is an action component, which is really information about what do we recommend? What's the recommended behavior here? What are we encouraging people to do? In these examples, the message is, at the bottom here. It's use the crosswalks. It's wait for the walk signal. It's give cyclists room to ride. Fear-based approaches provide usually easy to execute actions as the second part. So arouse fear, give an action to do instead. Interestingly, in practice, sometimes the focus of the threat is on the threat or the negative appeal, but the message might actually not even say or omit what's being recommended. That happens especially when the action seems really obvious. Researchers have found that road safety messages, for instance, often have that fear-only message, but do not add the what do we want you to do instead part of the message. This billboard is an example of a message that clearly identifies the threat, right? It arouses the fear, but it leaves out the recommendation part. And even though we might say the recommendation seems really obvious here, we do find oftentimes in fear-based approaches that the recommendation part is left out. In the formula for a fear-based approach is this. X is something to fear, therefore Y should be implemented to prevent X from happening. Distracted driving is dangerous, stop texting and driving. This is something to fear, death, injury, whatever it is, therefore stop doing that behavior. Yikes, this is really bad, whatever this is, but here's what you can do instead. I like this example. I'm going to show you a video. Actually, I'm going to stop sharing and have this video shown. Dana's going to show this video, but this is an example of a traffic safety message developed in New Zealand as part of their Road to Zero strategy. And I show it here because I think it's just a really good example of the ability to evoke that negative emotion, that evoke fear, worry, woo, yikes, this could happen to me. And whether we're talking about traffic safety or any other health behavior, that we often find fear as a strategy in drug education, in smoking cessation, in dental hygiene, in sedentary lifestyle behaviors, just to name a few. So Dana, I'm going to stop sharing and have you share that video.
Hey, Kari, it's frozen. Give me just a second.
No problem. Thank you.
I'm going to go back for just a second.
Kari, well, Dana is trying to get that to work. I'm going to ask you one of the questions that we have for you. So can you explain again why rule-based thinking is slow thinking? The questioner said they would think that that would be automatic or fast.
Sorry, you cut out. What was the question?
I'm sorry. Can you explain why rule-based thinking is slow thinking? They believe that that would be automatic or fast instead.
So like parent-child teen agreements might be an example of that. And the reason that it includes slow thinking is because there has to be a conversation, right? The conversation is what brings it in to have to deliberately think about it, to decide what their behavior looks like, to decide how they want to engage. And so just the act of the conversation helps to bring a strategy that can be fast thinking into a slow thinking strategy. So when we think about messages, for example, billboards, ads, our goal in those is to create conversation. So we want conversation to occur because that's what brings where people can start to grapple with, like, where do I fit? What do I believe? How does that fit for me? What would I have to change if I'm going to change my behavior? What could I do? What's something small that I could do? So it's really about helping strategies and thinking about ways to absolutely have fast thinking strategies, like environment-based design is great fast thinking strategies because it automatically helps to shape behavior without a lot of thinking. But also, what are the strategies that can fit that support slow thinking so that it becomes this behavior, that a deliberate behavior I'm choosing, that I can make that happen, where I have thought it through versus an automatic response.
Perfect. Thank you.
And and oftentimes too, Jamie, it's important, like it's oftentimes not one or the other. Oftentimes we can marry both modes of thinking.
And Dana, were you able to get the video to work?
What is 420 years? For big thing.
We can't hear the sound. No.
Okay, I'm sorry.
That's okay. Maybe we'll just put it in for the chat, and people can check it out when they have time, or if they want to. That's no problem. We'll just keep moving forward, and then people can check it out if they find that interesting. Let me go back and share my screen. All right. So hopefully you'll check that out. I think it's just a really great example that, and think about it if you decide to watch that video, how it absolutely evokes, what kind of emotion does that evoke for you? And and just think that through as you're watching it as well. So why fear? Why is it such a popular strategy? Why do we use it? Fear is absolutely considered a primary emotion that we all experience universally. It's considered this negative and unpleasant emotion that we as humans want to get rid of. We want to reduce. We don't like that feeling. And so fear, one of the primary impetuses of using fear is that it's going to motivate us to do something different. Fear grabs our attention and it's memorable. Absolutely. I think you'll find that video to be memorable. And the underlying assumption of fear-based strategies is that the assumption of trying to evoke fear is that because we're going to be emotionally confronted by it and it's going to have a negative response from us, we are going to want to change it. We don't want to feel that way. So does it work? Digging into the research, it's really clear that fear-based approaches are pretty polarizing. Some practitioners and researchers are confident that fear appeals do persuade, that they do persuade audiences. Other researchers say, not so much, that they might actually be counterproductive to our strategies, to the things that we want to actually change in behavior. So just to dive in and give you a little bit of context there was a large meta-analysis that was done that looked at fear, and it looked at fear appeals and how effective were they at changing behavior. This particular meta-analysis looked at 127 research articles, research studies, and it represented over 27,000 individuals. And what these researchers found is that fear appeals, that they are effective at changing beliefs, but they are more effective with certain things. They found that fear appeals were more effective when the focus of the message focused on one-time only behaviors versus repeat behaviors. So in other words, fear worked more effectively with behaviors that we only wanted the audience to do one time. Things like get a vaccine or other one-time behaviors versus behaviors that we want people to do repeatedly over and over again or over an extended period of time, like exercise or wearing your seatbelt every time you're in the vehicle. So the researchers found that fear works better with one-time only behaviors versus repeat behaviors. The researchers also found that fear appeals are more effective with audiences that have a larger percentage of female recipients than males. So fear, in this meta-analysis, it was found that fear appeals work better for female recipients than males. This study also found that fear appeals are more effective when they do add the threat to how to avoid that threat, how to avoid that, how to avoid the problem that we're encouraging them to not get involved in. Get the vaccine, wear your seatbelt, don't text and drive. So not just showing what the threat is, but also what is the behavior we do want people to engage in. And then finally, fear is more effective with issues that are unfamiliar to people than issues that are really familiar to people. So when we know a lot about a particular behavior, when we know a lot about an issue, fear appeals are less effective for those behaviors. There was another meta-analysis that was done that looked at, that examined how well threat appeals or fear-based approaches worked for driving outcomes specifically. And the results of this study suggested that there was a disconnect between the emotion of fear and the behavior that we were interested in of driving. The threat appeal did lead in this study to having people feel that increased fear arousal, right? They did feel that emotion of fear, but it didn't appear to have the desired impact on the driving behavior. And the key question, I think, the takeaway here is not, are fear approaches effective, but who are they effective for and what else might work? So when we think about what else might work, we know from various research studies that there are different strategies that can influence people to change their behaviors. And since we've been talking about emotions, we know that beliefs and emotions are connected and that we don't want to rely solely on eliciting fear. We can tap into other emotions that appeal to positive emotions that might have the desired outcome that we're seeking. That's the second strategy. When we want to think about how do we make the safe choice the easy choice, the second strategy we want to think about is how can we also elicit positive emotional responses. We know there's quite a bit of research out there that has explored different positive emotions and their effect on behavior, and specifically on their effect on reducing risky driving behaviors. Positive emotions, things like joy, empathy, and compassion, and hope are examples of positive emotions that we can seek to elicit and increase in our strategies. There was one study, that looked at the impact of fear versus positively framed road safety messages on young drivers. This specifically was on looking at young drivers and their self-reported driving behaviors. They were looking to evaluate an intervention to reduce risky driving behaviors. And in this study, they found that positively framed messages significantly decreased self-reported risky driving behaviors. They also found that using a fear-based frame versus in this format that they used, did not reduce risky driving behaviors. But in this study, it actually increased young drivers' self-reported risky driving behaviors. So there's definitely some research out there to suggest that we might want to think about what else can we use, because fear-based approaches are used a lot, but we do know that positive emotions and eliciting those positive emotions can also influence beliefs and behaviors. Hope is one of those positive emotions that have been found to be a suitable substitution for fear appeals in promoting safer behaviors. And when we think about hope, it's really defined as our perceived capability to see a path forward and motivation to use that path towards our goals. In messaging, we often go to that fear-based place, but there is real value in motivating hope. Now, you might be thinking that traffic safety is a serious issue and that we can't just focus on positive emotions because the impact and the negative consequences are real, and absolutely that is true. People do need to know the dangers and harms from engaging in risky behaviors. But I'd like you to think to yourself for a moment. What's the difference between concern and fear? What is that difference? Just think about that for a minute. We ask this question quite a bit with various audiences. And what we typically hear is that fear makes people move away from the issue. It makes people scared and panicked, and they want to avoid the issue. Fear doesn't necessarily foster engagement. Concern, on the other hand, concern raises a person's level of interest and curiosity. Think about your work in traffic safety. How are you raising concern? Because these are really important issues that we're talking about. Traffic safety is so important. How are we raising concerns, raising a person's level of interest and curiosity? Concern makes people think about that issue, to engage those modes of thinking. In our work in traffic safety, we want people to be interested and engaged. We absolutely want to raise concern about our issues that we're talking about in traffic safety, and hope that there is a will and a way forward, that we have strategies, that we can do something to make a difference. Talking about what is concerning us, what the issues are, absolutely. And also doing it in a way that doesn't necessarily foster or grow fear, where people are scared or panic or don't want to even address the issue or don't want to talk about the issue. Concern helps people to engage, and that's what we want in traffic safety. We want people to engage with us, and then hope provides that way, the way forward to engage. And of course, we don't want to just focus on the positive, because the issues that we're addressing are serious and they can have devastating consequences. We need to focus on both raising concern and raising hope. But interestingly, we've learned that it's not an equal balance of hope and concern, raising both hope and concern. Researchers have found, especially in organization, this work comes from organizational research, organizations who are undergoing really big change efforts are more successful when it's actually a 4-to-1 ratio of hope to concern, when they're making big, sweeping change efforts. Communications that elicit positive emotions and hope, that we're eliciting more positive reactions than concern, is more effective. So really 4-to-1, 4 hope, positive, to 1 message focused on concern. I love this quote. I think when we think about strategies that tap into emotions, emotions can be absolutely inspire us to make changes. They can foster us to celebrate, to want to move forward. They can also, emotions can also foster feelings of anxiety and anger and fear. And I love this quote because I think it sums up really well this idea of evoking both positive and negative emotions. We are not thinking machines. We are feeling machines that think. When you think about emotions, thinking about eliciting positive emotional responses in the strategies that you're either already implementing or thinking about implementing, we want to start asking this of our strategies. How is emotion being used in the strategy that I'm implementing? And I'd like you to spend a couple of minutes in the chat box or on your own notebook at your desk, thinking about and asking yourself this question: how could I foster hope and concern versus fear in a traffic safety strategy that I'm implementing in my community or in my state? Go ahead and take a few minutes and add that to the chat now. Oh, lots of great conversation coming in the chat. Just thinking about the strategies that you're implementing How are we bringing in emotion? What does emotion look like in the strategy? And then are there things I can do to foster hope, to foster hope and concern at the same time without evoking fear? All right. And then finally, the third strategy we're going to talk about with our time left today is to talk about when we think about influencing behavior and how do we do that across our social context. We talked earlier that we don't make decisions in isolation or in a vacuum. Our choices are absolutely shaped by the relationships that we have with other people. Like I mentioned a bit ago, when we think about a cultural approach, we're looking at what beliefs and behaviors we want to grow across the social ecology. Because these social contexts, our family, our friends, our workplaces, all of those, our communities, our local communities, our states, we are all influenced by those nested layers of relationships. We're looking at what beliefs and behaviors we want to grow across the social environment because those absolutely do influence our behaviors. And this is our third strategy to think about. We want to implement strategies that support the behaviors we want to grow across the social environment. Knowing that our relationships that we have with others influence our beliefs and behaviors. As people working in traffic safety, we want to think about all of the strategies we're using across that social environment. What are we doing at each of those layers? We can also start to see that it's not enough to change the beliefs and behaviors of the individual. We've got to start thinking about changing the systems around those individuals too. These different strategies that we can implement across the social environment really can support and reinforce one another for greater impacts that can be sustained longer term, ultimately helping people to make that safer choice, making the safer choice the easy choice. I pulled this example of a project that we've worked on with the Traffic Safety Culture Pooled Fund. And this is a project that was sponsored by the Traffic Safety Culture Pooled Fund. It's a pedestrian safety. It was really focused on pedestrian safety, where we really thought about what actions do we want to grow across the social ecology for pedestrian safety. And I thought this was just a really good example of taking that cultural approach, thinking about the various strategies across the social ecology and what that could look like. So in this example, in this project, if you're interested on the Traffic Safety Culture Pooled Fund website, there's a lot more information here. But just to give you an idea of thinking of strategies across the social environment, at the individual level, when we were focused on pedestrian safety, the actions that we wanted to grow were things like encouraging pedestrians to use the crosswalk, encouraging drivers to use slower speeds. What were we thinking about at the family and peer level? We wanted to encourage family conversations about pedestrian safety and developing family rules about driving safety and driving safely and not speeding. Thinking about those different modes of thinking. How are we encouraging fast and slow thinking? At the school and workplace level, we really wanted to think about strategies to establish policies about safe driving, including strategies practices about not speeding in a work vehicle. Developing a volunteer crossing guard program to promote pedestrian safety. I won't go into all the details, but you can see from this example how we want to think about strategies to change and influence beliefs and behaviors across the social environment. And so I would ask you, what actions do I want to grow across the social environment to support whatever behavior it is that you're working on in your community. What strategies will support these actions at the different layers of the social environment? If you're willing, one last time, to think about that either in the chat or on your notebook at your desk, thinking about a behavior. You pick a behavior that you're working on right now. Think about a behavior you're working on and think about what actions do you want to grow across the social ecology to support that behavior. Go ahead and spend a couple of minutes now, either in the chat box or on your own, thinking about what actions do I want to grow across the social environment. So just to recap, and then I'm going to open it up for more of a large group discussion in thinking about the three strategies. When we think about how do we make safe choice the easy choice, we want to think different strategies. And one of those ways is to support intentional behavior change through strategies that support that deliberate and thoughtful slow thinking mode. How are we supporting both slow thinking and fast thinking in the strategies that we're using? Strategy 2, we want to think about emotion. How are the strategies that I'm using influencing the emotions of people? And how can I elicit positive emotional responses, not just relying always on a fear-based strategy? And then finally, how do we want to work across the social environment to implement strategies that support those behaviors and beliefs across the social environment? We want to think about strategies at each of those layers of the social environment to do that work. And now, Jamie, I know I was going to stop sharing my screen and just open it up for conversation, if that's a possibility on this platform. And then we'll move into final questions. Does that work on this platform?
We are not able to open microphones, so people will have to respond to you through chat and you'll have to read through them.
Okay, that's what I wondered. Okay, thank you. So just to, we'll move to questions in just a minute, but what I wanted to end or leave you with as a group, and we could just spend a couple of minutes on here, thinking about what of these strategies, when you think about these three strategies, what feels most transferable to your work? Or which of these strategies is your state or community excelling at? What are they doing really well? And where are those opportunities for improvement? I think those kind of big, high-level questions as you leave today or you're thinking more about your work and behavior strategies and behavior change, these are really good to come back to because I feel like we can start to think about these different strategies in the strategies that we're already implementing, things that we're doing right now. What are our campaigns looking like? What are the strategies that we're implementing right now? And then also, where are those opportunities? Where can we start to take what we're learning in the research and start to implement those in the strategies that we're implementing in our communities? As traffic safety professionals, I think we are often tasked with designing and developing strategies for what people should do, but we know that our that the best designs are not going to always align perfectly with what people actually do. And as we embrace the safe system approach, we're really recognizing more and more that our strategies must also support those behavior changes that we're seeking by making that safe choice the easy choice and being really intentional about that. We can use a behavior model to support our work. We can think about our work through a cultural lens. We can use strategies that influence behaviors that are grounded in the research. I've really enjoyed our time today, and we have a few minutes left. Jamie, I'd love to open it to any questions that you received, and then I will put also my contact information here. I love this conversation. I love talking about behavior change and thinking about our work in traffic safety. I love to keep this conversation going. If you have questions or you're thinking about something, please feel free to reach out to us at the Center for Health and Safety Culture or to Jamie at the National Rural Road Safety, and we can continue to have this conversation. But Jamie, I'll open it up for any questions or comments before we end today.
Perfect. We have quite a few, so we're going to try and get through as many as we can. The very first one says, my organization has a couple of people who depend on hands-free technology while on the road. My attempts last year to reach them through the multitasking is a myth exercise and emphasizing that your brain has limited capacity didn't work. How can I work on changing their beliefs about hands-free tech being safe?
Ooh, that's such a great question. So anytime I think about behavior change, like what are the strategies I want to implement? I want to start with understanding what are the beliefs people have about those behaviors. Is it that it's distracting? Is it that it's inconvenient? Is it that it's, so like starting conversations, we want to start from a place of what are the beliefs people have about that? If you're working with a really small group, it can be just a conversation, even a one-on-one conversation about that technology specifically, and starting for you as the practitioner or the traffic safety professional to think about what are you hearing from them as you're having that conversation? What are the beliefs that are coming up about that? It's inconvenient, it doesn't work well, whatever those beliefs are. Then you can start to tailor a conversation about those beliefs and start to shift them as you can. So I think that's one approach I always want to think about when I'm involved in a conversation with someone and we're talking about a behavior or a strategy that we've implemented or that we want someone to use. I always want to be thinking about, what am I hearing them say? Like, what are the actual beliefs they have about whatever it is that we're talking about? Whether it doesn't work or it's too hard or it doesn't save any time or whatever those beliefs are, I think is a good place to start. And then we can start to tailor the strategies to shift those those beliefs based on what we're understanding are the beliefs people have about it.
Perfect, thank you. And there's some great information being put into the chat pod as well on other things that you should consider as answers to that question too. Then
yeah, I know. Oh, I was just going to say there's such great wisdom, I'm sure, in this space. So it's awesome that people are using the chat for that as well.
The next question we had for you is, with the preponderance of interactive media that foster short attention, how does one interrupt such behavior to get someone into slow thinking mode to foster more foundational behavior change? Or should we focus more effort on short attention delivery methods for those who have habituated to such modes of learning?
Oh my gosh, this is such a great question, because I think we can grapple with this in traffic safety, but we're grappling with this in all of education and learning and different ways of learning and how and attention spans, and we're so used to getting information so quickly. I think we do, the research, I would say there is a strong foundation for helping us to say, like, we do want to focus on how do we move people to some of those slow thinking modes, because for sustained long-term behavior change, we do want to encourage and foster some of that slow thinking. We do need people to think about what they're doing. How are they doing it? To integrate what they're learning in, and with fast thinking, we take those mental shortcuts. And sometimes that is mistaken, but we do it all the time. And so I think it's really thinking about our traffic safety strategies in both ways. We have to embrace what is there, using the various very fast thinking modes of learning. But I also think we don't want to say that's it, that's what we have to deal with, so we're just going to only focus there. We do want to think about how do we create those intentional move people to slow thinking, and we have to be really intentional about ways to do that. It is through conversation. That's the one strategy that can support slow thinking, is through conversation. And so when I think about a strategy in traffic safety, how am I promoting conversation? Whether it's parent to child, whether it's coworker to coworker, whether it's, and maybe it's through a message to start, a billboard, a sign, or whatever, but how do then I move to thinking about how do I get people to have conversation about this? Because that's where we can see that's where I think we start to see sustained changes and in beliefs, and ultimately then behaviors.
The next couple questions all deal with the fear-based approach, and I see someone in the chat just asked one as well about putting a resource in there. So the first question is, are there studies for before and after fear-based approach campaigns that show that they lower the amount of targeted crashes?
Crashes specifically, if that's the question, I'm not sure. I know there are studies out there that talk about fear and the impact of fear on self-reported driving behaviors. And so that is definitely, there's some research out there on that. On specific to crash reduction, I don't know. That's a good question. And maybe others have some ideas in the chat. That nothing's coming to my mind that's like specific to reducing crashes.
Okay. Then next question is, are there diminishing returns on repeated use of fear tactics?
Oh, thank you for asking that question. Yes, we do know that, well, like I mentioned, it works better on behaviors that we don't have a lot of information about. We also know that it does have diminishing returns, that what once was fearful and really impacted us, the point of diminishing return happens quite quickly because, and oftentimes they even call it like a boomerang effect, right? Like it worked that first time, but the next time it's not nearly as impactful, and the time after that, and then all of a sudden I was like, that doesn't happen to me. I don't know and then the boomerang is that the person then starts to question, like, well, that's never happened to me. So, and then we start to question the legitimacy of it. And it might happen to other people, but it's not going to happen to me. So we start to create this divide, which is the exact opposite of what we want when we think about evoking, or wanting people to make a behavior change. Absolutely, there is a point of diminishing return on a fear-based strategy.
And then another question, it came both in the chat and in the Q&A, is, are there things that are considered education versus fear-based, like a rollover simulator or a seatbelt convincer?
I often think about, yes, I think about what can we pair. So there's a lot of strategies out there that are fear-based, and instead of thinking like, oh, I'm not going to use those, what do I pair with it? Is what I like to think about, because I know that there's a lot of vested resources that have been used on when we think about rollover simulator and all of those things. And so when I think about whether or not if I'm going to use that necessarily, but what am I going to pair with it that can support that support other emotional, evoking other emotions. What can I pair with it to generate that slow thinking, those kind of things. So I think it's not, should we use it, but also what else can I pair? If I'm going to use a fear-based strategy, what can I pair with it that might mitigate some of the things that we've talked about that might not be as effective?
And then the very last question that we're going to leave you with today before we wrap up is, do you have any examples of successful behavioral change efforts?
Yeah, yes, I think we've done a lot. I would encourage one place that's just coming to my mind right off. We do a lot of work across the country with states across the country and in traffic safety. And I would say, and I would recommend looking at the Traffic Safety Culture Pooled Fund website. We put all of the projects with the pooled fund on there. And we have, a lot of it focuses on traffic safety culture. So thinking about those shared beliefs that people have, and then and looking at behavior change of various specific behaviors. So we've looked at driving under the influence of cannabis. We've looked at a seatbelt use. We've looked at multiple risky driving behaviors. So looking at and testing an intervention for young adults that looked at not siloing behaviors so much, but looking at what were those underlying factors that go across multiple risky driving behaviors, things like impulsivity. So not looking at individual behaviors, but a strategy that could look at multiple risky driving behaviors collectively. So I definitely encourage you to look at the Traffic Safety Culture Pooled Fund website. I think that's a really good just place off the top of my head that shows a variety of different projects that I've been a part of that have focused on traffic safety culture, beliefs specifically, and behavior change.
Well, thank you very much, Kari, for all of this great information. And I also want to thank all of our participants, the resources that you've dropped into the chat pod, all of the answers that you put in there for Kari's questions, really sharing your expertise. It's what makes these webinars and our trainings fantastic, is when you guys can really share all of your knowledge as well and add that to what our presenters do. So we really, truly appreciate you for doing that. Thank you one more time, Kari Finley from the Center for Health and Safety Culture. And we will see you next month on our webinars for the National Center for Rural Road Safety. Have a great day, everybody.